of the Philippines. It is my pleasure then to invite Professor Darian to begin his talk.
Just making sure there's no price tag in this one. I think all of us felt what I felt right away, but it's just me because I'm the Ilocano in the room. I was like, okay, you should be careful with everything, just in case you cannot afford it. I just brought my car just in case we need the collateral if things go wrong. Thank you so much again for that introduction, Lisa. I'm glad you kept it short. I mean, to paraphrase Imelda, if you really need an introduction, maybe you're not really that famous, right? So, of course, her version is if you're really that rich, you shouldn't know how rich you are. Okay, what are we gonna do today? My goodness, I'm sure a lot of you came here, not necessarily for me. I'm sure you came here for this fabulous collection here. I came also here looking forward to the things that we're seeing around us. This is like visual saturation at the highest level. Some of you, of course, maybe are coming here because you may have chanced upon some of my more serious writings, including for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, or maybe one out of a million probably read some of my books, including on some very interesting people, just Duterte and Trump, those kind of people. And maybe some of you are here because you came across my vlogs. So sometimes I don't know if I should be depressed or happy that people know me for my more ridiculous version rather than my serious stuff. So today you're going to see a version of both, right? So you're going to see a little bit of a Latino spirit, but there's going to be also the kind of a Tolstoy, Russian, Navalny spirit, right? So it's kind of a combination of two, right? So, that's why one quote I love from Napoleon, which I think there are many quotes about Napoleon. I don't know about the horrible movie made about him recently, but he said his mind is like a set of drawers, and he takes out whichever drawer fits the purpose of the moment. I think that's perfect if you want to be a politician, but I think it's also perfect if you want to be a kind of a thought leader nowadays, because I first read the room, right? So just a few days ago I was giving a talk in Washington DC. I'll go back into Europe soon, so you have to read the room. And when I was trying to read the room, aside from the price tags and all, I was like wondering, how should I? What kind of cadence, and should I drama, should I be serious? So just to warn you guys, I think this talk, I cannot even say if it's a lecture, it's more like a 1001 Arabian Nights or more like a French Cannes Festival movie than your typical lecture, Hollywood, strict premise, predicate, conclusion. So please bear with me. If you feel a little bit more confused after this discussion, I think that's a good sign. And I look forward, hopefully if we have enough time, for sufficient discussion later on. Because since I have no secretary, I apparently had a conflict today. I have a class lecture on Sahab when I was in class kanina. Because I just get invitation, right? And like, yeah, sure. And then like, oh my goodness, like I have 2 events in like back to back. So I'll try to not gonna skip through some parts, but I think some of the parts I'll not over-explain it. I mean, all of you guys are extremely intelligent. You know a lot of our history. So I'll try to focus on certain parts that perhaps I didn't discuss in some of the other lectures that you guys attended before. Of course, I don't try to give you the same dish. My approach is fusion and my approach is evolution. And since September, when we gave a talk in Yala also about this topic, a lot has changed for the good, I think, in many ways. Now, let's go to our discussion. I just noticed that I have the same color theme, which is good because this is AI generated. I just put it in my PowerPoint, give me a nice background, and just suddenly that pop up. So probably they were spying on me through my webcam, what I was wearing. Can we go to the discussion? Okay. First, let's go. I mean, I'm going to be very lawyerly and academic about it. Let's start with caveats. Right? It's usually what we do so that we don't get bashed too much. Although I'm too much used to getting bashed. I mean, right? It sounds so elitist, right? Like Ilustrados, social, and then with my Konya accent and all of that. Like, what are we trying to do here, right? Why are we even discussing this great men and women of history? Why do we even care about it, right? And as someone who comes from UP, we're very, we're leftists. That's so right by the whole. We're supposed to talk about the movement of history and masses and all of that. But if you look at the whole literature of the great men and women of history, I mean, there's one person we have to really blame more than anyone else is the Scottish Ilustrado, their own version of Enlightenment. This is Thomas Carlyle. where he talked about three major genres of great leaders. He talked about artists, he talked about philosopher, he talked about political leaders and statesmen, right? And to be honest today, in academic circles, we kind of look at it as a pedestrian understanding of history, right? You put the great guy there, everything's gonna be fantastic. I mean, that's essentially the story for politics nowadays, right? Now, can we go to the next slide? The first, actually, most extensive critique of that perspective that I saw, I didn't get it in a political science book, interestingly. I didn't even get it from the most interesting philosophers out there, my favorites like Gramsci, or the Frankfurt School, or even the Foucaults of this world. I actually got it from literature. So, one of the books I used to, thank God I'm an old millennial, because honestly, like nowadays, it's good luck finishing a 1,000-page books, especially a novel. Back in the day, there was always brownout in Manila. This is like 2010, 2009. So whenever there was brownout, that's the time you bring out the Russian novels, right? This is the time, like grim, rainy, a little bit colder than usual, especially from Baguio, like perfect to read my War and Peace, right? Or Anna Karenina. So in War and Peace, if you look at the opening chapters and all, it's really a parody of Napoleon, right? So Napoleon comes out there as essentially a kind of a pretender, right? A guy who thinks he is the pivot of history. As my quote-unquote favorite philosopher, G.W. Hegel put it, he's a world historical figure, right? A kind of history astride a horse or something like that, right? And he said, no, it's just Napoleon happened to be the right Corsican, who I think are more Italian than French, right? In the right moment, in the right country, right? Right moment being the French Revolution, and right country because they had the Grand Armée, right? The gigantic, well-trained French army, right? In a way, he was implying that anyone you put there, France would have, just steamroll its way. And in a way, perhaps he's implying that the reason why, he lost in Waterloo is because of more Napoleon, because of the mistake, rather than. But anyway, what you see there in the opening chapters is really an emphasis on the grand impersonal forces, or vast impersonal forces, right? This broad sweep of history. This is what makes Napoleon a Napoleon, right? So there may have been so many military geniuses out there that we never know about, because they were not just born in the right country. In fact, one of the guys who pointed this out in our era is Warren Buffett, right? This is something like, if I were born in a country like Bangladesh, no offense, Bangladesh, by the way, is a rising economy nowadays. I don't want to get into trouble. This is not a stand-up comedy yet. He said, if I were born there, I don't think I would be Warren Buffett. I was born in the right family, but he's an old white man. And you know what I'm saying? And he went to the right school, and that put him in the right network to become Warren Buffett. And so, structure, role of structure, right? Now, interestingly, there's a way out of this debate. Is it really vast impersonal forces of history, as Tolstoy put it, or is it really about the great man and women in history? Next. Sorry, like the Haciendero guy. Like, next. Walang clicker eh. Like, baka the clicker will have a price tag to The kind of semi-compromise out of that is actually a kind of a new Marxist perspective, right? Anthony Giddens, his theory of structuration. So structuration, this is what I love about being not just an academic, right? When you're an academic, you're always looking at how to make things complicated, right? So that you look more technical, right? I just said, just to simplify it, what it's saying is it's the man meeting the moment, right? In fact, there's a direct quote from Marx that we don't choose the circumstances of our birth, but we can choose how we respond to it, right? Which is kind of stoic, almost Marcus Aurelius meditation time, right? So this is a way out of it. And to be honest, personally, I'm kind of there. I've been kind of there because as someone trained in UP, a little bit progressive back, I always felt guilty with overplaying the role of the elite or the great men and women of history. Especially overplaying the role of great men, right? Just men, right? But let's do this, all right? Let's have this discussion next. So, I really love this picture because this just gives you an idea of the diversity. One of the things I always hate, I hear politicians, ako ay kulay moreno ay kulay ng Pinoy, mga ganun. And I say like, no! Right? Being Filipino never was about skin color, or a certain race, or a certain even language for that matter, right? Just look at our founding fathers. Unfortunately, not many mothers in that picture, but I can go about Tandang Sora and all of the great women who contributed to our revolution. Just look at the diversity there, right? This looks like, I don't know, This is like a Hollywood production today of, like a Justice League from 5 different continents, right? You can have some Latino look, some Espanol look, some Chinese Asian look, right? All sorts of things. Fusion, right? This is what being Filipino was always all about. So I find it almost offensive and a disgrace to our forefathers when people try to reduce Filipino-ness to a quote-unquote race, which in today's modern genetics doesn't make sense. There's no such thing. Right? Anyway. Next. So actually, just last week, I used to travel a lot to Washington D.C. during the time of Trump and Duterte, right? And always my joke was that the leaf doesn't fall too far from the tree, right, or something like that. So, but this time when I went back to Washington, I said I'm going to spend more time here because last year, the past years, I was a lot in Europe because of the Ukraine conflict, Munich Security Conference, Spain. We were with the ambassador, etc. So actually, I went a little bit posh European and all of that feeling stuff, right? But this time, I said, you know what? I'm going to pay attention to the United States, not only their politics and what's happening today. I want to go back to their roots. So I multiple times I went back, not only for good pictures and videos, the blogger, but I just, and especially when this vantage point was very important, the one in the middle. I was just looking at it and I was wondering, it's like, my God, what would the forefathers of America feel about their country today, right? I mean, Abraham Lincoln is a special guy. I mean, I don't know many people in history who have been praised by so many other great people from across the political spectrum. Karl Marx, Gandhi, Tolstoy, all of them praised Abraham Lincoln. So there must be something special about it. You know what was shocking? I was there trying to get my blogger picture, 4 MAGA kids coming with MAGA and all of that, right? So it kind of left a taste in my mouth. So I kept on coming back, especially the US Supreme Court, which is more Greek than Greek, right? This is more Parthenon probably than Parthenon, right? And I was like wondering, what are these guys trying to do when they build those beautiful monuments, right? And do not forget, the American founding fathers were all Renaissance men. I mean, they're the kind of people that Rizal would have felt at home with. I mean, Jefferson was reading about Islam, he was reading about Silk Roads, he was reading about, I don't know, whoever you can think about. René Descartes, those were the kinds of leaders America had. And that architecture, that just glorious, majestic architecture, no offense, but I didn't even see that in Europe. I mean, essentially a slice of Paris and Rome there, right, in Washington. It represented the state of mind, the ambition, the scale of grandeur that the American founding fathers wanted to create in the New World. Now, obviously, we can talk a lot about the whole horrible things that happened to the indigenous people and all of that. That would be a long conversation. But what I extracted out of that moment, especially the picture in the middle, I was just looking at it, was, I was imagining if not only the goddess of justice, right, but if the founding fathers were now looking at American Congress and the QAnon people there, right? Was it Marjorie Taylor? Those type of people. Like, what would they think about? But that also made me realize how leadership is so important, right? You may have the most beautiful buildings out there. You may be in charge of the world's most powerful empire ever. But if you have problematic elites in charge, it does something, right? So that's where it actually dawned upon me. It does matter to have great leaders and all. That indeed sometimes great men and women drive history and whole nations in the right direction. And if you look at the actual essential definition of nation, nations are artificial constructs. And they were not constructed out of nowhere. They were constructed in the minds and deeds and speeches, sometimes actually a narrow elite, before it trickled down. So this is also the other texture of reality that we cannot deny. Next. So which brings me to, the person that actually made me fall in love more with our Ilustrados and Rizal. Benedict Anderson, in fact, the Anderson brothers, right? Both Perry Anderson, Benedict Anderson, they write like, for me, like there was life for me before reading the Andersons, and then there was like life after reading Andersons. No offense to Tolstoy and everyone else I read, but as far as political writing is concerned, the Andersons are just something that were a breath of fresh air. Like just the breadth of their writing, right? And they just speak like 7-8 languages lang naman, diba? These guys are out of this world. But if you look at Benedict Anderson's reading of nationalism, a lot of this was constructed. And it was not constructed necessarily by the colonial Western powers. That's why he said, in fact, if you look at the history of modern nationalism, a lot of them emerged out of anti-colonial struggles, including Simon Bolivar, Creoles, And Creoles should be something special to our hearts because a lot of our founding fathers were Creoles or influenced by Creole culture and all. So, and not to mention, Benedict Anderson fell in love with the Philippines. In fact, he fell in love with Rizal. I mean, the way he wrote about Rizal just makes you ashamed of yourself. Like, how did I not realize this guy is so smart? If someone that the Economist magazine calls an intellectual giant like Benedict Anderson was so amazed because his thesis was, had Rizal not died and if he had managed to stick around 20 more years, he would have been the first and so far only Southeast Asian to win a Nobel Prize in Literature, right? Remember, Nobel Prize in Literature is not given based on PR or political positioning or I know the ex-president of the US or something like that. No, it's based on merit of your work and lifetime of work, right? And no Southeast Asian has won Nobel Prize in Literature yet. Ibang usapan pa in science and all, right? Medyo ibang level yan. So, his thesis would have been that Rizal had a very good chance of winning the Nobel Prize. But anyway, that just tells you and in fact, I think Benedict Anderson in his head was debating what was Rizal really trying to say. Because there was just so many layers to Rizal's mind and argument, which we'll discuss later on. Next. So I'll just give an outline, just to give you an idea why I give all the caveat. So very quickly, I'll first discuss philosophy of history and the psychology of identity, which I think the second part is more important. Then, very quickly, Philippine nation-state formation, some of you are already familiar with it. Third, what I call Philippine exceptionalism. And a lot of this actually came out of my discussion with my very good friend, si Leloy Claudio from University of California, Berkeley. We had a number of discussions, you can see it in our podcast and all. And then let's go to the Ilustrados, then go to really the discussion part. Next, yeah. So what is history, right? I can go on Hegel forever, but I'll spare you all of that. And just, our let's say, pedestrian understanding of history is really facts-based narratives or empirically verified facts. Narratives about the past to not only make sense of the present, but also to inspire a better future. Because history is not just a collection of facts. It's a narrative, and narratives always have an emotional and psychological dimension to them. That's why being a historian doesn't mean you're just, scribbling through things from the past. It's not archaeology. It's different, right? And that's why if you do history properly, you can move a whole nation in the right direction. And in many ways, Rizal was doing his own history. A lot of them were amateur historiadores, right? And history is tied to identity and hope, really. If you look at it, proper history is done. It's really a search not only for a golden past, but also how to pave the way for a better future. But the thing is, in historical discussions, especially, let's say, pedestrian historical discussion, nostalgia is a very powerful emotion. I think nostalgia is one of the most powerful emotions in politics today, if not ever. I can talk about whole movements, from Taliban in Afghanistan, I was going to say like I'm going to be in trouble, right? But you can guess what I'm talking about, right? A lot of proto-fascists, a lot of very conservative, a lot of them are about nostalgia. A lot of them about a supposed golden past, and then we're trying to bring them back together. You can see, anyway, you have an idea why I had to, Okay, and then it is also about dealing with this problem, because a lot of nostalgia, some use the term false nostalgia, but that's actually repetitive. Nostalgia is by nature false, right? So it's this connection from the past, and it causes disorientation with the present. It's a powerful thing, and we'll discuss it. That's why we have to keep on going back to our past and try to re-understand it. But your understanding past is shaped also by your current reality. And your understanding of the past also shapes your understanding of the present reality. That's a simplified version of Hegelian dialectical reading of history. But anyway, moving forward. Yes, next slide. Is there a next? Okay, yeah, okay, fantastic. All right. Actually, all of these things, my emotional investment in this topic really started, I'll be honest about it, my good friend Jorge wrote about this in his Manila Times column, was, when I had the chance, and thanks, I think the ambassador is gone, and I think the ambassador is happy, hindi ako nag-TNT sa Spain, right? I think we have a lot of problems. No, for me, the emotional connection really came with an event we had last year in March, the Tribunal, right? The Filipino State Tribunal. And, the tribunal has been going on for a while, right? Filipino, Spanish, policymakers, businessmen, whatever, they come together every year. Yes, but that last year was really special, I would say. Not only because I was there, but it was special because my goodness, I mean, Rizal was officially, right, inducted into the canon of Spanish literature there in Instituto Cervantes. I mean, it was really something special. But as special as it was, there was always something melancholic about it. Not only because, well, it's melancholic in the sense that some would say it's very belated recognition of the brilliance of Rizal and his contribution to Spanish literature. But there was also another melancholic, Past Lives. I mean, if you watch the movie Past Lives, the emotion you get there is very similar to the emotion I got when I walked into that place. Can we go to the next one? So, this is Rizal, and then you can see the name of other great Spanish writers and thinkers, whatever there. For me, the saddest thing about this, can we go to the next slide, is you guys probably are familiar with Lacan, right? The French psychoanalyst. For him, there's life before language, and then there's life after language. Like when the child learns language, that's where he enters the social world, right? Before the language, it's just an innocent being, right? Because we don't speak Spanish, or some of us speak, I don't know, Carabao Spanish or something, you kind of feel like a pre-language person approaching the penultimate expression of Spanish literature. And it's just too huge again. It's just too huge again, right? So you have Rizal here, included as a canon of Spanish literature. And then you're a modern Filipino there, so proud about Rizal, and I was like, yeah, but I'm gonna read the best translation of it, right? Which is crazy, right? Which is crazy. I mean, of course, Spanish and English are both European languages in the European, but for anyone who has any idea or has familiarity with 2 or 3 languages, you know how different it is when you read an English translation of Rizal, no matter how good the translation is, including the latest one from Penguin Books, which I draw on, right? I mean, for instance, I realized that, especially when I was reading Benedict Anderson's analysis of Rizal's novel, like Benedict Anderson had to dig deep into French surrealist literature in the late 19th century to figure out some of the anarcho, violent terrorist, in fact, like the jar thing that Simon was gonna use for, for the bombing and all of that, like he kind of traced where that was coming from. I'm talking about El Filibusterismo. I know that she speaks about the other, but El Fil is really my favorite. So, and then when you look at certain lines, like the line specter of comparison, right? Like there's certain lines in Rizal that you can have 3 or 4 different interpretations about. What was Rizal trying to say there? That as a Filipino, it's scary to compare us to Spain, or that there is a kind of a haunting similarity when we compare something in Manila to Spain. You get what I'm saying? You lose all of those layers when you translate it into English, or Filipino, or Ilocano for that matter. And it's just weird because honestly, right? Like how many people do you know around the world who cannot read their founding fathers' documents in the original language? It's just strange. I mean, and I realize Philippines is also the only country that was colonized by 2 very different colonizers. Like American and Spain are totally different countries. So are we surprised that we're kind of confused if you think about it, right? We cannot even access the original language out there. I mean, the ultima adios, like just look at the most emotional, sentimental farewell of Rizal. Like, okay, you read this one, and then you go to the translation. I mean, it's crazy. There are few countries I know in the world whereby they cannot access their own founding fathers' documents in their origin. It's like the founding fathers in US wrote in French, and then like today's Americans are like struggling to get a sense out of it, right? That's the psychological distance that I felt was always very painful and melancholic. And I think that also explains why, I mean, Amber has done a fantastic job with the whole Rizal without the overcoat thing. But I realized, like, it's not only him being like Ilustrado and it's the fact that we cannot even fully appreciate his work in his own original language. In fact, Benedict Anderson, by the way, a lot of correspondence of Benedict Anderson was with Amber Campos, so I think we have to do a lot of credit to him. Now, apparently Rizal wanted a 3rd novel. There's a lot of discussion about it, but he wanted to write it actually in French because his sense was Spanish is the language. What did we call paralong pambansa? Like Spanish was like kind of second rate now by this time, right? French was the global literary language, right? I mean, this is our luck as Filipinos today, that we now speak the tier 1 language. I mean, I hate to say it, but But Rizal actually was contemplating seriously writing his third novel in French so that it can reach more audience and all. Which would be even more problem for us, right? Because you had to learn two languages to access probably what would have been his even better novel. I mean, honestly, for me, El Fili is super more superior to the other one, right? The other one for me is like nice, sentimental, Latino, whatever. The second one for me is really like next level. It's almost like Dostoevsky level for me, the El Fili. And so, God, imagine if he wrote the third one and it's like in French, right? It would have forced us up to learn both French or Spanish or something like that. Anyway, I'm just telling you, Lacan came to my mind. Like we're like those children, pre-language children, when we approach the grandeur of the literary output of our ancestor. That is why, I'm sure you know, see I'm there. That is why I like the paintings at least, right? When we go and do that. Because at least the painting is more something we can have a communication with in ways that I cannot have in Rizal's work, right? So in a way, Juan Luna is much more accessible to us, or Hidalgo and other, because of the fluency of the visual language, rather than the depth and multi-layer aspect of the Spanish language embedded in Rizal's works. Right? Next. Maybe I'll just skip through this part. next. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you know what I'm gonna say, right? Just Google my name, Richard Darian, authoritarian nostalgia. Yeah, I think Lisa should have said, like, this guy just wrote like 2,000 articles, so you can check that. I'll just go through this part. No, for me, this is all derivative problem. You see, when you don't have any connection to your past, maybe we'll go to the previous slide. When we cannot even access the language of our founding fathers, are we surprised that we're confused about what happened in our history over the past 100 years? Let's be honest, right? I mean, today in the US Supreme Court, which by the way is also not the bastion of merit and all of that, there are people there who are literaries, essentially, right? They go back to what Jefferson and those guys were arguing 200-300 years ago. We cannot do that, right? I was like, good luck doing that in the Supreme Court today, right? So, we have to refer to an American jurisprudence or something like that. So for me, there's a psychic wound. That's the term I'm going to use there, which I didn't use in previous lectures. So some of you, I know I repeat students here. Half joke. There is a psychic wound there that I realize is unique to us Filipinos. And I'm not being melodramatic about it. I think it's something serious that we have to deal with, right? That is why I always found this idea of being Filipino is just this and that. I think it's just a way of coping mechanism with this very cosmopolitan, diverse, out of this worldliness of our founding fathers and mothers, right? I mean, this psychic wound for me is a very powerful thing. Sige, let's move forward. I think I already quoted Imelda Marcos a while ago, so next. Yeah, and the other things, I mean, probably I want to skip also through this side because apparently I got to know a little bit more about Alcantara and history in Spain, but the other thing, like for me, one of the other shocking things is we in the Philippines, we're so into basketball and all of that, right? When in fact we were like a solid footballing nation, right? At the beginning of the 20th century, we're so solid. We're beating the hell out of Japan and China and all of these countries, right? And we were so solid that we actually, in our national team, it was captained by a guy who was the best goal scorer of Barcelona until, you know, just the best player of all time came in, called, it's not Ronaldo, called Messi, right? So, that's what I'm saying, right? So, but no one knows about it. I mean, unless you're from Iloilo, right? Because I think the stadium there is in Alcantara's name, right? And then, of course, I did some more research. I realized about his politics, but I don't want to go there, right? But, you see, just a simple thing as our fascination with basketball and how it completely buried the football history of glory is again a metaphor or another manifestation of these disjunctures we have in our history and all. Now, I'm sure there are many people who wrote about this, but for some reason, I'm not coming across a lot of this stuff. So, for me, I'm honestly thinking out loud as I talk to you right now, as I process these thoughts and ideas. This is really something unique to the Philippines. I think it's this kind of psychic wound and these disjunctures, right? That I think we really have to therapy our way through these kind of discussions and intellectual discourse. I can see the room is turning green already, but don't worry, the punchlines will come later on. Next, next. Now let's do the boring part even. Mini lecture, now very quick. I'll just go very quick about this because we have to have an idea like we're on Earth. Remember, the man meeting the moment. So we have to discuss the moment very quickly. So next. So just conceptually, right? Nation state. So there are two different concepts we're talking about, right? So the state is a Max Weber, centralized hierarchical political entity exercising legitimized monopoly of use of violence over defined people and territory. Sovereignty, what is sovereignty? You're talking about legitimized authority over defined realm, check Bodon, and nation. It's imagined communities, right? And actually there's a darker side to nationalism, right? Because if you do anthropology, you come across the term schismogenesis, that your affirmation of your identity is always in contraposition to someone else, right? So that contraposition is very, very important in the formation of nationalism or sense of community. That's the Carl Schmitt version. I won't go into history of Carl Schmitt, very controversial guy. The Benedict Anderson version is more or less like common glories and pains, right? When you go, so that's why memorials to World War I and World War II are so important to conceptions of, let's say, French national identity. Or in the case of Germany, them coming to terms with the horrible things that came during the time. And look at Putin, he's still talking about Second World War and how much Soviet forces sacrificed to defeat the Nazi forces. That is still very central to his affirmation of Russian nationalism in 2024, right? So those are basic concepts. Next. But, you know, I mean, we also forget that there was a bunch of islands back in the day which were part of a bigger ecosystem across the Indo-Pacific, right? From Indian Ocean to the Pacific. What we call today the Philippines was part of that system, right? And it actually had very rich culture. So if you just walk down there to Ayala Museum, you'll see in fact, one of the things that I found most amazing about our pre-colonial history is the influence of India, Indic culture. It's very, very strong, right? And in that sense, actually, we see a lot of similarity between us. And then you go to Borobudur, then you go to Cambodia, you go to southern, even all the way to central Vietnam, Da Nang, right? You can see a continuity of culture there. So our pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial past was very Indic. We were part of it. In fact, Manila comes from the word Nilan, which is the color blue, right? So again, how much do we talk about these things? I only talk about these things when I'm, with the Indian ambassador or something like that, when we discuss, strategic issue and cultural overlaps and all. So we had a very rich cosmopolitan culture before they came in. And a culture that was actually also very gender neutral, in a sense, if not matriarchal, right? But the reality was there was no defined politics. And in fact, as we'll discuss later on, quickly just go through that, there was really absence of a unified, coherent political entity. I mean, we still haven't found a trace of anything like, what you see in Borobudur, right? Or Angkor Wat, right? For some reason, for some conspiracy reasons, we never developed those kinds of monumentality that we see in some of our neighboring countries, right? In fact, Nick Joaquin had a term for it, right? A culture of smallness or something like that, right? So, again, if you look at it, we're also exceptional in a way, even within Southeast Asia, right? So there's like multiple layers of uniqueness and exceptionality. I'm not passing judgment on that being good or bad. I'm just saying there's also, as much as we shared that in the culture, there was also that kind of differentiation and all of that. So if you look at what we call today Philippines, next slide please, I want to go faster through this because I want to really go to the discussion part next. It is, let's be honest, what we understand today as Philippines, for everyone's sake, the term the Philippines, right, is really carved out of Iberian imagination and colonial conquest, right? I mean, that's the reality. I mean, again, how many countries in the world have you found that they're named after a guy from, I don't know, on the other side of the world, totally unrelated, and I heard some dodgy things about that person, and King Philip II, of course I'm talking about, right? Like, I mean, just randomly being called after some guy because some, I don't know, cloud chaser wanted to ingratiate himself with the monarchies back in the day. Yeah, like, this is again something very exceptional and distinct with the Philippines that I found when I even compare ourselves to our neighboring countries. Next. And there are other elements of exceptionalism. The dominance of friars in running the country, which Rizal called friar robbers, right? I think Paraguay or some countries in Latin America may have some similarity. But again, this was something special. And then, of course, the galleon trade. That's where you see a lot of economic cosmopolitanism in the Philippines. But we also have very relatively limited number of Spanish in the Philippines. I mean, until the Suez Canal thing and all, right? Now, I'm glad I was corrected by Jorge in this, because my understanding was a lot of people here, and I'll blame Nico for that and all, is that a lot of them had Basque or Catalan background. I mean, like, my middle name is Foronda, which is Basque, right? But apparently, a lot of them had Andalusian background. I was correct on that. Thank you very much for that. And it was the only sustained Spanish colony in the whole region, right? We were the heartland of the Spanish East Indies. And here I had some debate with folks. I mean, we were ahead of all our neighbors in terms of overall level of literacy. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about single digits growth, right? So, 333 years, but in terms of the depth of the intrusion of Spanish culture, it was still a very narrow group, right? Again, so there's so many layers to our colonial past that we just gloss over. But if you pay attention to them, you'll understand how things come together, these different pieces of the puzzle. Next. Now, but today, we don't talk about those exceptionalism, right? We don't talk about, our Indic background. We don't talk about, how we came about with the name of our nation. Today, we always talk about, Filipinos, ganyan lang sa Pilipinas, right? One of the things you always hear in the Philippines is, and I find this shocking, you know why? Because everything I was telling you a while ago was to impress upon you how cosmopolitan our founding fathers were. How the Philippines, as an emerging nation state in the early modern era, was a product of all of these impersonal forces from across the world. And later on also personal forces. But today, we talk about Philippines as if we know no other country in the world. Right? We talk about Philippines as if we're just comparing ourselves. We always compare ourselves to first world countries. And then we forget that, we forget another 180 countries along the way. And for me, if you only know one country, you don't know any country. Right? And if you only know one country of a certain type, meaning third world, then you really don't know what third world is, right? So for some of us who have the privilege of visiting many third world countries, I'll tell you, many things we think is only in the Philippines is not really only in the Philippines. You think we got the worst traffic? Go to South Asia, right? They have different level of worst traffic. I mean, you think our taxi drivers are interesting people? Go to, I don't know, Cairo or Istanbul, right? I could go on about that. Next. We think we have the worst fake news problem in the world. My goodness, go to Brazil during the time of Bolsonaro, right? Or good luck, go to South Africa. It gets even more interesting there if you look at the fake news and all of that. Next, we think we're the happiest people. You have no idea how happy our friends are in Nigeria and Africa if you look at some of the surveys. But if you look at next survey, actual empirically measured happiness, we're barely in top 50 in the world. Actually, the happiest countries are Scandinavian countries because this is based on quality of life, not just, are you feeling good now? Because I'm so depressed, I'd rather just laugh at it, right? Next. So, but I digress, right? You could say, but I digress. I knew I was digressing. So, let's talk about this part, the Philippines being at the center of global history, right? So, what I showed you guys is how paradoxically we Filipinos are a product of very international cosmopolitan forces, and yet we're so parochial when we think about nation or province and all. We barely are curious about learning about others because we cannot even connect to our own roots. You get what I'm saying? That psychic wound affects also how we relate to the rest of the world, especially the fellow post-colonial global south world. Next. So if you look at the Philippines, there's also a lot of glamorous part to our history, right? Which should give us a sense of, oh wow, we used to be something. Now I know everyone, the pedestrian version is, essentially the golden era Maharlika days, 1970s, right? But actually you have to get a little bit more than 1970s. Then you'll realize really the interesting history that we had. Actually, the interesting thing I found in the Philippines, because originally this lecture was supposed to be like a secret history of the Philippines, things that are not usually talked about. So I'll just quickly go through the things that I believe make the Philippines beautifully exceptional, not exceptional in problematic sense only, or ambivalent sense. One was the galleon trade, because if you look at the galleon trade, it was actually the real first burst of globalization. Because Silk Road did not connect Latin America. It just connected Eurasia and North Africa and all the way down to Mali, for instance. I mean, we can have a debate about that. But it was really with the galleon trade, from Mexico to Philippines to China. So we were the Singapore before there was a Singapore. That's what the Philippines was. That's why we should not be surprised. So now I'm going to the Ilustrados. Where did the Ilustrados come from, right? They didn't come out of nowhere. They came partly out of these impersonal forces of history, this true first globalization. So here you can already see, just look at the fashion of our ancestors, right? 200 years ago. It was as cosmopolitan as it can get, right? You see Asian elements, you see Latin elements. I remember, we had an event in the University of Malaysia This is like 10, 15 years ago. And there was a cultural night, right? And I came in with Barong. And the president of the university was looking at me and he couldn't figure out, like, where is this guy from, right? Like, is this Cuban? Is this Mexican? Is this Filipino? Like, what's going on there, right? So just in that cultural night, by confusing our neighbors, it just dawned upon me how cosmopolitan we are. And of course, physiognomy also in Filipinos have very diverse looks and all of that. Next. So, for me, the sexy century really for us was the 19th century. Really, it's not 1970s. I think the real Maharlika era, golden era for us, was 19th century, except no one cares to read about those times. This was the time that, Spain began to take the Philippines more seriously, right? Because they almost lost the Philippines to Britain. I mean, the British controlled this area for a few years, right? I mean, full-fledged. This is the 7 Years' War. So after that, there were reforms, and then after Spain lost Mexico, and then lost much of Latin America, with Simon Bolivar, 1848 revolutions, they really were left just with Philippines and Cuba. Then Suez Canal comes, they take care of more of us. But interestingly, even if the British left the Philippines, in terms of full colonization, a lot of their companies stayed here and they invested in the Philippines. And so we had actually one of the first bursts of industrialization in Asia was in the Philippines. Right? We always think about Japan as the first industrialization country, but actually the first burst of industry, a lot of that was happening here in the Philippines. And that's why a lot of our elite, okay, I'm not gonna name names, right? They go back 200, 250 years ago. Find a single Zaibatsu or a single, I don't know, Korean version or whatever. They're kids, right? Because I was just in Tokyo the other week, and I was in the Psycho Watch thing, and the founder of Psycho and all, and I was saying like, wow, by this time, the Ayalas were already like what, a century in business already, like their old elites in Japan are just like over 100 years ago. Our elites, some of them go back 200 years ago, right? Or even more. Some of the political elites we have. Right, so this just gives you an idea of what the Philippines used to be in the 19th century. Like that's the baseline we had in the 19th century, where I believe really this is where the reputation of the Philippines as a kind of a global metropolitan city came in. And even when galleon trade was over, there was still a lot of bursts of activities here. We became more oriented towards Asia and Europe, no longer dependent on Mexico as we used to be. As you know, there was a long time we were not really ruled by Spain. It was really just Mexicans, right? Anyway, next. So this is the whole Las Perlas del Oriente thing, this course next. And then there was chaos, right? One of the things that we tend to always see in history is whenever there's rapid pace of prosperity, that's also where there's a rapid explosion of revolutionary spirit. Because I don't want to do basic political science here, but revolutions tend to happen not in countries of complete destitute. It happens when relative expectations outpace the actual trajectory of growth, right? I explain populism essentially that way. Have you noticed? Populists have been emerging in many countries that actually have been growing very fast. I'm not talking about the West, I'm talking about the East, India, Philippines, right? Turkey. These are countries that are actually growing very fast. But the problem with growth and prosperity is that human tendency for expectation always outpaces what the reality and physics of economics can deliver, right? So you have the rise of the new middle class with new appetites, with more appetite for political representation. And for some of you, I mean, we'll discuss that very shortly later on, you watch Gomborza, right? You can see by the time of the Gomborzas, there was already a decent number of Filipinos who could speak multiple languages, who have traveled all around the world, and they could not accept why they're not treated as full human beings, in a sense that they're essentially treated like subhumans. And as you know, in the movie Gomborza, in the opening line, you're talking about a number of Creoles, men who look more or less Espanol or European, right? Still wondering about why they cannot enjoy, right, the full rights of a Spanish guy. And I think the best line for me in the Gomborza was when the supposed liberal Governor General told our good friend, "You should know your place," right? That's where you see relative expectation outpacing what the system could deliver to them. And that's where the revolutionary spirit was bubbling out. So the Gomborzas were not the first. Well before the Gomborzas, you had a whole number of other guys, including a Mexican guy who became an emperor overnight, right? Who tried to push things in the right direction. But it's actually really with the Gomborza when you see the indigenously raised Filipinos, a lot of them with Spanish background, really asking for more. And that's really what sets the tone, right, for the rise of Rizal and the Ilustrado class. So in a way, it's technically incorrect to call Rizal the father of the Filipino nation, because he was arguably just the third generation of people, right? Nauna pa yung kuya niya who was influenced by the Gamborzas, right? So then again, even us calling Rizal the first Filipino or father of the nation, for instance, or treating the Juan Luna and Rizal generation as the forefathers, tells us how poor our understanding of our own history is, right? That actually the first persons who pushed for the creation of Philippines, a lot of them were pure Spanish blooded or partly Spanish blooded, right? So again, this is where I think we have to have a better, proper understanding for history. Next. So this is where the Ilustrado era comes in. Now I want to go to the discussion part because, sorry, I had to skip a little bit through that list. I want us to have more discussion. I want you guys to challenge me. Next. If you look at the Philippine Revolution and Ilustrados, again, we tend to understand the Philippines as kind of we're the pioneers of revolution in this part of the world. And we tend to look at it from the axis of the Philippines and Spain, Madrid and Manila. But if you look at the actual literature, a lot of what was happening in the Philippines, with Rizal, with Luna, with all of these Ilustrados, that they were also very much enmeshed in what was happening in Latin America, including what was happening in Cuba. In fact, a lot of the revolutionaries in Cuba and Rizal and all these people were intersecting with each other in Madrid. And in fact, there are a lot of books there in Latin America whereby they're a collection of great revolutionaries of Latin America, and Rizal is there. He's included like one of the Latino, right? Now, why is this important? Because this is again the ambivalence about our culture. We tend to think that the Philippines was actually the first revolutionary country in Asia. Well, that's correct. But if you look at it properly, we're actually also the last revolution of Latin America, right? We're way behind curve than everyone else. Which also tells you, so this is where the ambivalence, as much as we're prosperous and ahead of curve, we were also very politically backward country. Politically speaking, we're way behind most of Latin American countries by this time, right? And that's why we're almost the last Latin American proper or ex-Spanish colony to gain our revolutionary, to have our moment of revolution. And then that's where the double tragedy happened. The Americans came in and just stole the day away from us, which is what didn't happen in many other ex-Spanish colonies. Again, this is where the psychic wound, the psychic wound has many elements to it. It's not just loss of language, and we know the Americans had a systematic approach to making sure we cannot access the language of our founding fathers and all. That was part of the American colonial project. This is what double colonization means. It means also doubling and multiplication of the psychic wound and disorientation. Because the more you're disoriented, the harder it is for you to mobilize and resist colonization, right? And yet, and this is where talagang Filipino never gives up, right? And yet we still continue to be at the heart of global developments. Next. So even when our Ilustrados were defeated, a lot of them retreated to Tokyo, right? And actually in Tokyo, there was an event in early 20th century when revolutionaries and nationalists from India, from South Asia back then, from China, they all came together and they proclaimed Rizal as their father inspiration. And later on, that would be very much crystallized in Southeast Asia. That's why you have many people in Indonesia and Malaysia named Rizal, because he's seen as a Malayan hero, but he's also a descendant Asian hero. Next, we would still also be at the forefront of. This is the quote, right? This is from Tim Harper in Underground Asia. So this is the Asian Solidarity Association. This is what they formed in Tokyo back then. He said, with support from Japanese Indian industrialists, including the Tata family of Parsi businessmen, a Sino-Indian Asian Solidarity was founded. At the second meeting at the Unitarian Chapel in Udanshita neighborhood of Tokyo, Filipinos and Vietnamese attended and expanded to an Asian Solidarity Association. They embraced Jose Rizal, a Filipino writer, social thinker, and national martyr in the resistance to Spanish rule as a quintessential patriot of the new Asian future. This was a reflection of the impact that the heroic violence of the Philippine Revolution of 1898 had across Asia. Now, where things get really tragic here is that back in in the Philippines, just as the Indians and the Chinese, and others were proclaiming Rizal, the Philippines was being completely pacified by the Americans. And that is why something really sad happened. So when the Japanese invaded Manila, one of the last Ilustrados and revolutionaries who did not submit to the Americans returned with the Japanese, and they formed the Makapili army, right? Now, you would think this guy was crazy, but in the mind of this person, he thought that Filipinos will never forgive the Americans for stealing away the revolution. Just to come back to the Philippines and realize we were fully okay with being Americanized beyond recognition, right? So again, you see this kind of double weirdness whereby the ghost of Rizal was inspiring anti-colonial revolutionary movement, and then the last leftover of Ilustrado is going back to the Philippines and realize, oh, we're totally over that. We're okay with that, right? But what's interesting next is that there was continuous resistance, not only to American colonization of the Philippines inside the Philippines in some ways, but within a much more democratic Commonwealth system. But more importantly, back in America also, there was a lot of resistance to American colonization of the Philippines. Now, we all know about, the debates in 1898, and the great literary figures back then who were against the colonization. But what I didn't know, and I discovered, there are a number of very good books here that actually discuss, on one hand, the Philippines was where American empire was built, in a sense that they practiced everything that they would do to the Vietnamese, to the Iraqis and Afghans in the next century here in the Philippines, right? The pacification of Huk, rebellion and all of that. We still had a lot of resistance here in the Philippines to Americans except in the provinces. But the other thing I didn't know about, and I discovered it just the last year, was actually back in America, a lot of minority groups fighting for minority rights, they were also mobilized with what was happening here in the Philippines. That what was happening in the Philippines actually inspired not necessarily an anti-colonial movement, but anti-white supremacy movement in the United States. So if you look at a lot of groups that were involved in the civil rights movements in America in the 1960s and 50s, they do a lot of references to what the Huk was doing in the Philippines, to what the Ilustrados were doing in the Philippines, to the injustices of American colonization. So here, not so actively, but our very existence as this weird nation of double colonization and our revolution being stolen away was still inspiring a revolutionary spirit in the heart of the empire, which is inside the United States, right? Including Washington. Again, this is where you see the Philippines is at the nexus of so many major movements. Not only the perfection of counterinsurgency strategies by America, but also, I would say perfection, but the acceleration of civil rights movement, for instance, in the United States. Again, these are things that we don't know. I didn't know about. Maybe you guys are better informed than me. So there's so many things you can understand about the 20th century whereby in one way or another it goes back to the Philippines. My good friend Lelo has an upcoming book. The title is something like Empire of Austerity. When he discusses how America's global financial strategy, right, the gold standard and all, they perfected here in the Philippines first. They experimented with us before making it globalized after the Second World War. So then again, one of the tragedies I feel with us Filipinos, we forget how central we have been, either directly or as a byproduct of our resistance to, or what we inspired in the major empires of the era, especially the United States by the 20th century. Next. But let's be honest, today when we talk about the glory days of the Philippines, there are essentially two groups. One group looks at the 1950s and 60s, which is slightly more accurate, which is saying, actually, well, the Philippines was one of the fastest growing post-colonial nations in the 50s, especially late 50s and early 1960s, I think together with Czechoslovakia, etc. And that's why the Asian Development Bank was chosen to be put in the Philippines. We beat Seoul, Korea, we beat Tehran, and we beat even Japan, Tokyo, right? And eventually they had to put it. There's a reason why ADB was based in the Philippines. Now that's the DFA building, by the way. They have to move later on. So the standard liberal argument is it was the 50s and 60s which was heaven, and then suddenly, the devil comes and takes it all away, and then that's where the whole discourse of golden era comes in. But I would say that actually our tragedy is we had exceptional leaders in the 19th century, late 19th century, all the way to First World War and Second World War. and now I'm gonna make a lot of enemies. I think we have been lacking really good leaders since we really became formally an independent nation, right? This is really my argument today, right? So all of this was just a setup, right? So I'm just using all of no, but that's my point, that this is the ultimate tragedy of the Philippines. It's not only the double psychic wound, but it's also this sudden vacuum of great leadership. And when I say great leadership, I'm not talking about Juan Luna genius level or Rizal genius. I'm just talking about competent technocrats who get their job done, right? Or a competent state that makes sure a few people don't control everything, right? So let's go to the next slides. I hope they don't regret inviting me now. So, I mean, there's just so much work out there whereby practically all our neighbors in East Asia had one version or the other of a developmental state, right? A relatively competent bureaucracy, right? Which cajoled, right? And coerced the elite and the business class in those countries to build globally oriented industries. For just some reason, it never happened in the Philippines. I mean, where is our Samsung, LG, where is our, you know what I'm saying? I can go on and on about it. I mean, yes, we have great beer and I don't know, stuff like that. It's great, it's lovely, okay, but I don't know beer. But you get what I'm saying? For me, this is the dearth of world-class business and political leadership. This for me is so shocking. To go from Rizal in the Ilustrado class to what was happening before First World and Second World War. For us, having our heroes being Asian heroes, and then since we became finally formally independent country, we have not produced that kind of core group of great leaders that we need. I mean, you want to call them young Turks or whatever, right? So what we have had, both pre-martial law, during martial law, and after martial law, in the continuous absence of a developmental state. I mean, I'm very much simplifying this. This is a long conversation. So the problem with the liberals is that they tend to argue things were fantastic until certain people from Ilocos came down and took over everything, right? With the imeldific wife, right? The problem with that side is they think, oh, their 20 years in power was the amazing years, and then these pesky liberals came and ruined it again for us, right? Except both are wrong. What's consistent is both of them have been failures in their own versions. And that plays into the psychic wounds we have, hence the cluster mess that we find ourselves in, conceptually and intellectually. Next. So I'm hitting every side, para lang fair tayo, right? This is open. So if you look at the Philippines, I'll be honest, you know, I've studied elite in multiple countries around the world. It's easy to say, as far as our, you know, it's almost the worst type of oligarchy we have. Because it's a facade of democracy, right, combined with warlordism, right? And when you put that with democratic elections, you get the worst outcome, right? Because essentially you're setting up people to be, you know, for vote buying and violence and intimidation and disinformation and all of that. There was just something super wrong with our state building project and all of that. And for some reason, we never produced a group of people or a 4 years presidency. I don't know how much you can do really in 4 years, or some sort of like Japan's version of METI, Ministry of Economy, Trading, to just fix this mess. It just never happened. It just never happened for some reason, right? And that's why we find ourselves in a predicament whereby, forget about Vietnam, now we're worrying Cambodia overtaking the Philippines, right? And we have this kind of defeatism and all of that, which is the final part of our discussion. I'll push back against that defeatism. Next. So this is the reality. So in 1969, the Philippines had the biggest economy in Southeast Asia, the gross domestic. This is World Bank data. By 1994, and you know who was in charge chunk of this time, right? We're like what? Number 3, 4, 5. And by the way, Vietnam is, you know, knocking at the door right now, right? We're just lucky that. And honestly, the only reason we didn't fall even lower is because of our off-dollars, to be honest. If not, you know, I mean, there are very few countries in the world whereby 10% of their GDP comes from overseas remittances. I mean, I'm not saying that we didn't do anything back in the Philippines. I'm just saying, whatever we are right now is actually on kind of a borrowed state, right? Not that other countries don't have that, but the level of remittance dependence on the Philippines is crazy, right? So, this is for me the crazy thing. Like, why are we not producing those kind of great leaders? Next, I'll just go through that. Honestly, I think, you know, Ninoy got it right there. I mean, This is so quotable, right? Sabi niya, Filipinos are bewildered about their identity. They're an Asian people, not Asian in the eyes of their fellow Asian, and not Western in the eyes of the West. I mean, he's thinking things that I'm thinking right now, right? He said, lately they have taken to insisting they're Asian, but they're so American-oriented that by reflex they still react and respond like little brown Americans. You know, like, you can go on and like, there is a rudderlessness with us, but I think where Ninoy failed to argue is that psychic wound I was talking about. I think it was not fair to us. It was not fair to us. He did not try to understand where is the root of this rudderlessness, this kind of mixed, messy identity crisis that we're facing nowadays. Next, having said all of that, this is where I'll bring. Did you watch the movie Prestige? Yeah, Hugh Jackman and all. I said like it's the last act which is the most important, right? You set it up, but the thing has to come. But this is where I feel there's a second chance. I will call the 20th century the lost century for the Philippines. Honestly, it's one of the most. If there are few countries as depressing as the Philippines in terms of trajectory. If you look at a whole century, the 20th century is a very depressing one for the Philippines. I can go on with many examples. Another example I give you, like we're bombed like hell by both Americans and also Japanese, but mostly Americans in the case of Manila. And then later on, the Americans kind of asked us not to ask much from the Japanese because they needed Japan against Soviet Union. Can you imagine like the things that happen, the injustices that happen to our country, right? And then we never developed the developmental states, right? That kind of cadre of elite bureaucrats, technocrats that will build national industries, globally oriented. So 20th century, I'll be honest, it's a lost century. There's no point in forcing the argument. The Maharlika Club will have their own version of distorted reality. The liberals will have their own version. But the reality is both are wrong. We really lost the 20th century, especially since we gained our independence in mid-1940s all the way. But the good news is we're getting a second shot, right, in the arm, right? Maybe this time we may have a chance. And I'll just give you some basic numbers. I'll go very quickly through that. This is the reason why there are enough middle class in this room, where people who can afford some of these very expensive paintings, right? Maybe we're not doing too bad after all, right? Now, if you look at it, the trajectory for the Philippines actually is not too bad. And I won't say these are mumbo-jumbo science. Just by our demographic momentum, by our resources, by our geopolitical positioning, by geoeconomic reasons, by things that are happening today. Salamat sa ating magaling na Pangulo, right? We're moving in the right direction, right? I would say the Philippines is in a good trajectory in spite of its government and its politicians and all. Next. If you look at the Philippines, we are on the verge of becoming what I call a middle power. In fact, the last thing I want to discuss here is that we tend to have also this obsession with thinking of ourselves as a small country, when in fact, look at it. Next. In terms of GDP, next. We're expected to be in top 15 countries in the world in half a century from now. I know you're going to say it's ridiculous, but actually I'm running out of surveys that do not put the Philippines in the top 20 or top 15 in the next 30, 40, 50 years. You think that's a long time? It's not a long time, you know? I realize 30 years went by very fast, right? So we'll be almost as big as Japan and Mexico in terms of GDP size in the top 15 next. And actually, within next 5 to 10 years, this country will legitimately among top 30 economies in the world next. But what I hate is, why do we call ourselves a small country? Look at it. We're number 13 in the world out of 200 countries, right? Our population is as big as Mexico almost, right? Have you heard anyone say Mexico is a small country? I heard a lot of things being said about Mexico, but not small, right? So I think the other problem we have here in the Philippines is we also tend to forget our own scale. We're like 120 million people. We're not a small country. And that's why our economy is increasingly a mid-sized legitimate country. And increasingly, last part, if you look at it, we're actually considered as a middle power. A country that is not a superpower, but has enough capabilities, enough resources to become a country that can speak for its own and have a degree of autonomy in between superpowers next. So actually, if you look at the Philippines, whoever you put as a president there, we are in a sweet spot. I believe, yes, we have problems in the South China Sea. The Taiwan crisis is very serious and all of that. But have you noticed how much respect Marcos Jr. gets when he goes all around the world? I don't think that's a reflection of Marcos Jr.'s greatness per se. I think that's a reflection of their confidence in the trajectory of the Philippines. I think whoever you put there in Malacanang today, including si Hi, or anyone put there, right? They're gonna get a lot of respect. Again, it's not a function of who the president is, it's a function of where they see the Philippines going. Because remember, this is game theory. How you treat countries is not how they are today, but what you expect them to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's why everyone is scared of China or is praising China, because we all thought they're going to be number one by this time. Once we realized that's not the case, suddenly everyone's recalibrating. With the Philippines, I know that for a fact, because I've been speaking all around the world, and I believe you, 10 years ago, if there was a program in Washington, D.C., there'll be 4 Vietnamese, 3 Chinese, 2 Thai, and there'll be 1 token Filipino there. Aquino, throughout all those years, being such a good ally to the United States and all, I think he barely got a single state visit or anything like that. BBM, he drops by White House. It's not even state visit. It's just an official visit. He got the all the guns salute in Pentagon. He's treated. Again, this is a reflection of their estimation of our country's place in this world. But more than our place, it's also our geography that makes us very important. And I'll tell you, the good news is, I've been to Tokyo, DC. I'm going around right now. Is this may also finally be our chance to move into the high-tech industrialization phase. One of the conversation happening today is you don't want all the semiconductor industries to just be in Taiwan. So now it's all about diversification. It is true that we may not have the best investment circumstances, just to be honest about it, but this is also about betting on the future. This is also about diversification. And as more and more countries want to diversify away from China, they don't want to also put all their eggs in the Mexican or Vietnamese or Indian basket. They're giving the Philippines a second look, a second chance. And I think that is why it's very important that this time we get it right. But as I said, we cannot get things right for a country in the 21st century if we do not appreciate our greatness in the 19th century, in relative terms, and the mistakes and shortcomings and failures we had in the 20th century. That should be the scale of our imagination and strategic thinking. And I think that's what has been lacking in our discourse. Our discourse goes back to 70s and 60s and 50s, as if that is the ultimate horizon that determines what has been happening today. When we have to think deeper and longer, but we also have to look forward to the next 50 years and 100 years if you want to talk about nation building. I'm already going to the last part, sorry. So we need strategic vision. We need a strong state, not a strong man. And that's the problem. I think that's the challenge for us in political education. How to make people believe that what we need are strong institutions rather than strong men. You cannot shortcut this. We are in the right circumstances, but we have to do the right things. And we need our own 21st century Ilustrados, right? It could be the Department of Finance. It could be our good friend behind this gallery, right? It could be vloggers. It could be educators, right? Being Ilustrado is not about doing great paintings or great books. It's about excelling in all fields that will be important to nation building. So let me end on a more dramatic note. So this is where we're gonna get. As I said, if you look at how we should understand a national struggle, the beauty about national struggle is that a greatness of a nation is immortal, right? So for me, one of the most dramatic nations anywhere on earth is Russia. That's why I love the novels. And so obviously many people are devastated by the death of Navalny and all. But if you bother to follow his own quotes and interviews and all, he always said, my death will just set another great example for the next generation. And I don't think Navalny was out of his mind, because Navalny was also inspired by the likes of Sakharov, right? I mean, if you just read the history of Sakharov, I mean, my goodness, this guy was the hero of Soviet Union, behind their hydrogen. This guy was their Oppenheimer, right? And then he turns against the Soviet Union and he gives up everything. I think he's the only guy who should have won at least 2 Nobel Prizes, not only for peace, but also for physics. He was a genius. He gave it all up, everything up, to fight for what was right. And he said there couldn't be peace if there's no human rights and justice. Look at the speech of his wife when she received the Nobel Peace Prize in his behalf. It brings you down to tears. But Sakharov also didn't come out of nowhere. He was inspired by their own version of Ilustrados, the Russian intelligentsia, Dostoevsky, right? Everyone after Turgenev, essentially, right? Tolstoy, right? All of those guys. I mean, we can actually hear some of the recordings of Tolstoy when he was responding to the brutal massacre of women during the 1905 violent suppression of the revolution. He said in Russian something like, "You cannot live a life like this anymore." And you know what's shocking with that is almost exactly 80 years later, Mikhail Gorbachev, would have almost exactly the same conversation with his Politburo members and say, "This is not how we can live our life." And that's why he decided to embark on the Perestroika and Glasnost. So, the beauty of living in a nation, not just in a family, right, is that almost immortality of greatness, right? That you can pass down from one generation to the other and to the other, right? And the good news for us Filipinos is that we have also our own versions of Salvador's. We also have our own version of Dostoevsky. Next, I mean, I would easily put the Ilustrados at the same level as the Dostoevsky's class, who inspired every 20, 30 years their own version of greatness in the Soviet Union law. I mean, I know I've seen some critics, they're not overly impressed by Juan Luna because they say, "Oh, he's still classical style, he's still..." I don't care. I mean, he was beating Europeans in their own game. That was an important thing to do. Before you go, I don't know, Picasso, right? Go to the next generation. You first beat the masters, or you show that you can beat their masters. Now, some may want more avant-garde art. I don't care. I just want brilliant art. And as a Filipino, I mean, when you go to the museum in Spain and you see the paintings like up front in front of your eyes, before I had the chance, of course, to see the beautiful other Juan Luna painting in Ayala. I mean, it just shames you into like, what did I do with my life? You know, I was like, okay, this guy, what age was he again? Like what have I been doing with my life? Right? I love that feeling, being shamed into not being good enough, right? And accordingly being inspired to be something better, a better version of yourself. And I always think of it, a guy as genius and accomplished as Juan Luna or Ilustrado, the racism they had to face, all sorts of horrible things, and yet they still kept on defying, kept on creating. I should stop whining, right? You know all of these memes about, you know, older generation and the Gen Z, and you're like, it kind of makes me feel like the Gen Z guy, like, you know, whining around. So I mean, for me, that's it. That's why it's important we go back to the Ilustrados, because they shame us against whining about, oh, why we're not here, napag-iwanan tayo ng Vietnam. Like back then, these guys were not even considered as full human beings by the imperial authorities of one of the most backward empires by the end of 19th century. I mean, how offensive that must have been to the genius of mind of Juan Luna, right? Next. Of course, right? Next. And obviously, these were not perfect men, obviously, right? My goodness, you don't even need to read Nick Joaquin to know all of them had insecurity complex, narcissism, some of them psychopathic, some of them criminal. I mean, you can go on and on about it. They were not perfect guys, right? But it's precisely the transcendence of human imperfection. That was something that, I mean, the same way, Navalny is not a perfect guy. We can talk a lot about his Russian chauvinism, right? You think Dostoevsky was a perfect guy? He was a gambler, right? He was almost dying himself to work to pay his debt, right? I mean, this is not about being perfect. This is about transcendence of your overwhelming imperfection through transcendental grandeur and achievement. That's what really makes these people special to me. Next, they're more like Suicide Squad than Justice League. Right? And no, they were not very revolutionary. In fact, a lot of these Ilustrados didn't have very progressive ideas. They were very feudal, right? If I can put it that way. So no, this is not about putting them on a pedestal, right? It's about what they were achieving in spite of their class biases and limitations and all of that. Next. But this is also about, that's why we have to go back to the Ilustrado, also the forgotten Ilustrados. I mean, I'm not saying this because I'm Ilocano, but to be honest, if you were to ask Benedict Anderson out, I think he would rate Isabela de los Reyes actually as the smartest Ilustrado, even ahead of Rizal. In fact, Rizal was so competitive with this guy that he had to come up with his own semi-dodgy version of pre-colonial Philippine history, because the anthropological studies that Isabela de los Reyes did was like amazing. And I think this is also the problem, we're a bit too sentimental. Like Rizal, because he was martyred, probably this guy didn't die, right? He lived long enough to be a senator, to push for labor unions, so he doesn't have that drama and grandeur thing. But in terms of intellectual capacity and contribution in the birth of Philippines, my goodness, Isabela de los Reyes, next level. Next. And then of course, we have this unsung heroes or unsung anti-heroes, right? I mean, I appreciate what Ore wrote about For instance, contribution of a number of other great Ilustrados. Some of them even demonized in our history. In fact, Rizal was not the first Filipino novelist, right? The first Filipino novel was actually Nina, right? So this is the thing. Not only we don't try to learn enough about the past, we narrow it down too much, right? Or we forget the other ones who could also be an inspiration. I mean, to be honest, for me, Isabel de los Reyes is someone we have to study carefully as a possible inspiration for the 21st century, for instance. So we can make a whole series about the forgotten Ilustrados, for instance, right? Who had also a lot of intellectual capital behind them. Next, I'm going to the last, but this is why I still love Rizal, because my goodness, again, if I said there was life before the Benedict Anderson, and there was also life before reading again Rizal properly, as a mature adult person who went through a lot of trials in life, and then, compared to what you just read in textbooks, just because it's required by someone, right? Suffer, but also work. I think, next, what Padre Florentino was telling Simon, in my opinion, was the ultimate argument of Rizal. I think this is where we see Rizal at his ultimate political analysis maturation. I think he's the greatest Filipino political analyst of the 19th century. I think he would have been a great pundit, right, if he were around, if we had television and all of that back in the day. I mean, of course, my favorite quote from Rizal is, "Why independence today if Karens will be tomorrow's?" What's the opposite of Karen, right? That's I love about Rizal, di ba? Like, you wouldn't have Karens if hindi tayo nagpapakaren, right? Brilliant, right? I mean, it's like, you have to earn. You must win and deserve freedom. Because if you just have freedom on a silver platter and didn't work for it, which is kind of how we got it in the mid-1940s, I'm not talking about 1898, then you don't know its value, and you have it under false pretenses, right? This is a very nice quote. He said, "Why give a groom a wife when he doesn't love her adequately, or for whom he's not ready to die?" That's essentially his metaphor for true nationalism and patriotism. But where I want to be fair to us is that it's not like we chose the circumstances of our independence, and that's also the part where it's tragic, right? Again, find me another country in the world that was double colonized, double psychic wound, wins days, then give them on stable platter after the Americans bump the hell out of the most beautiful part of Manila, right? But again, are we talking about these things? No. But should we go and cry and whine forever? No. Because the result said, or like Padre Florentino said, we just have to suffer, bear and forbear, and work and keep going, and that's exactly where you have a chance of success. Why do I say this? I say this because when I talk to older people in Korea, in every country in the world that has succeeded over the past 50 years, that's what they will tell you. 40, 50 years when they said, oh, we Koreans want to create cars, our own automobiles and all, everyone laughed at them. Do you remember the first Korean cars, Kia, that came out? I mean, they were a joke. Like the front is Volkswagen, the back is Audi, the side is Toyota, right? Look at the Korean cars right now. When the Chinese Cherry car came 15 years ago, we were laughing at the name. Who buys a car named Cherry? Now you go to Dubai, in posh areas, you see Cherry cars. So 20 years ago, they were laughed at. But what did they do? They just suffered, kept on going until they hit the jackpot. That's how national development happens. And good leadership is someone embraces that kind of motto. It's not about a magical moment. It's not about one moment of genius. It's not about one battle. It's not about one EDSA or two EDSA. It's about protesting, fighting, mobilizing. You see, I first thought revolutions are a sprint. Then I thought they're marathon. I realized it's actually an Olympics. You have to know all sorts of different ways to fight back against not only tyranny, but mediocrity and complacency. That's why nation building is always a difficult thing. And that's why you need inspiration, beautiful art. And that's why you need to be in touch with the grandeur and greatness from the past so that we keep on going. So that's why for me, that was the ultimate argument of Rizal. We have to suffer but continue to work until hopefully one day we may hit the jackpot. And that's just the beginning of the next cycle. On that note, thank you very much. I know I didn't want to be dramatic, over dramatic, but I hope you guys see what I'm trying to do here, right? what I'm trying to pass down here is not information. You guys are more informed than me on many issues. I'm sure I may have said something preposterous here and there, but it's the sensibility I'm trying to pass down here. It's that sensibility that we need to bring back again, right? Because at its very heart, art is not just for art's sake. I don't think that's why Juan Luna did this beautiful art. And I don't think Rizal wrote those literary works just to come up with beautiful literary work. Okay, over talking. Looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for that. Pleasure. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon everyone. I am Richard Heredia. Sir Richard, kato kayo. Richard, you mentioned that the Philippines has been lacking good or really great leaders post-colonial. So I just remember my dad. My dad worked in the US for more than a decade. And when he came back and he hears the news, the local news, he would sometimes say that, oh, the Philippines would be better off if we just become a province of the United States, just like Puerto Rico or Hawaii. So, yeah, I get kind of disgruntled. And then I also remember, this is not verbatim, Manuel L. Quezon's quotation saying that he would rather see the Philippines be run like hell by Filipinos rather than be like heaven, run like heaven by Americans. So, what is your comment about this?
It just came from Sam. I'm not going to name names. I mean, I'm just shocked at the number of Filipinos I meet in the US, second generation who don't even speak Tagalog or Ilocano or any language. Like, show me a Vietnamese American, a Japanese American, I don't know, an Indian American who don't speak their mother language or their parents' language, right? And one of the explanations I always get is that's their best chance at assimilation. But I find it weird. Like, you can actually have multiple languages and multiple person, and you can still perfectly assimilate. And in fact, from a competitive standpoint, it's good to be able to speak multiple languages. But for some reason, again, I cannot blame it. I think there was just so much frustration with the failures of our political governance and our economy in the 70s and 80s and 90s that when those people migrated to the United States, they almost didn't want to do anything with their mother land. And in a way to protect their children from being either polluted with the nonsense back home, the idea was that let's just fully Americanize and all of that, and whatever that means, right? So I find that always depressing. But at the same time, I also realize there are many Filipinos nowadays, right? Second generation who want to get back in touch with their Filipino side. Actually, I didn't have a chance because I overtalked. Can we go to the last slides actually? The spirit is alive. I mean, there was a fantastic for instance, a movie by Jen Tolentino, my director friend, Filipino American friend, where you can see the Filipino American spirit and life, right? So I think now in our era of identity politics and identity reaffirmation, we see more and more Filipino Americans trying to get. But for me, that's not an isolated thing. It's part of a broader movement. The other movement is like Filipino food, right? Like now there's a lot of conversation about how to make Filipino food get its rightful place on the global platter. You know, honestly, I felt most offended when I had a British friend coming to me and say, I mean, you know, they're cheeky with me. I'm always cheeky with friends. He said, Richard, Ricardo, like, you guys are like the English of Southeast Asia, right? Like, what do you mean? Like, you know, your food. And he's like, of course not. I said, nothing is as bad as your English, right? Your food was so bad you had to colonize India, right? To get good food. And of course, I just among friends. But you get what I'm saying. A lot of our neighbors, it's Thailand, which is very successful with diplomacy, or Vietnam. These are countries who kind of get several things right in the 20th century, so they're enjoying that. In the case of Vietnam, it was a very brutal thing, right? They had to fight so many wars, 3 Indochina wars, which completely solidified their sense of nationhood, and also solidified their state institutions and all, right? Which allows Vietnam to rise. For us, kasi, wala. Most of 20th century, we just relied on America to provide our external security, right? Our oligarchs, economic oligarchs, they were just doing the same thing they were practically doing in the 19th century, right? The same, you know, just grab a land there, put the real estate there, and make some beers there. Yeah, like, no innovation, nothing, right? Seriously. Some of them have 200 years to innovate, right? 100 years. But now, some of them are getting into more high-tech business. Like, for instance, Ayala's, right? They were part of the contingent that Marcos had going to DC last year, and I think they're signing like production of electric bicycles or something, they're trying to get into robotics. So the new generation of some of these big families, whether it's Aboitiz, Ayala, etc., Gokong Wei, for instance, there is an outwardness. So when I say Ilustrado, I don't mean just, politically oriented activist people. It could be new generation of business leader, the new Gokong Weis, the new Chazas or Aboitiz, whatever, right? I don't want to name drop, but I could look like I'm doing political campaigning or something. But what I'm saying is that my criticism of the 20th century should not be read as a predetermined understanding of what would happen in the 21st century, because there's always this sudden changes and sudden sparks, right? And then there's also the vast impersonal forces. Everyone wants to get away from China and find an alternative. So now we're finally in that kind of good position, right? But it's about man and women meeting the moment. I think the moment is coming, and we're having more and more new generation leaders that can move in that direction. So, what I want us, see, the relationship I want us to have with history is not a whiny, depressing one. It's about learning the mistakes, remembering the grandeur, and then building the future. That for me is the winning formula. And practically every successful nation can think about today, South Korea, Vietnam, Dubai, when you talk to your average people, their understanding of history has that element to it. Of course, everywhere, not unfortunately because of disinformation, populism, whatever. But you see, it's your relationship, psychological relationship with history is very important. And in the case of the Philippines, I think we really have to have a conscious effort to deal with this psychic wound, this double psychic wound. And that's why one of my proposal is maybe we have to learn a little bit more Spanish, right? At least a little bit effort about it, right? Especially now with AI. There's that AI, was that personal assistant, AI or something like that? Not People's Initiative. So I think my friend Lelo is using that to learn Spanish and all. So you never know, they might be, I look forward to using AI to better understand some of the parts of Rizal's writing in Spanish, for instance, right? So that's what I'm saying. So this conversation was not supposed to provide answers. This conversation was supposed to pass down the sensibility for us to look for the right questions before we arrive at the right answers. That's the level we are in my opinion. So thank you very much for that question. All right, maybe there are like 3 questions or something, or violent reactions. Just make sure you can afford things you.
Good afternoon. My question is, can be answered categorically, yes or no. In your honest opinion, the democratic project of USA in the Philippines is a succeed or fail? 1. And number 2 is the coming business delegation of the American by March 11. Do you think it is a real business or it's a campaign for Joe Biden? Because it's the biggest project, which is the CHIP Act. I've researched, the Philippines is not yet in the radar for that. Number 3 is the train, the Southern Bicol train is a symbol of the first industrial revolution. Do you think it needs to be restored, yes or no?
I meant 3 persons, but I can jumble those things together. Are there any other questions, and I can get back to that? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for that very enlightening talk you just gave. It's so refreshing everything. Actually, we're not lacking in we're so rich in those models that came before us. It's so clear that they establish and they set things for us already. I think basically you open that up. It's just that a matter. It's easier now because things are all in one click of our hands. Basically we just have to, sensibility. You're saying everything. We just need to look back and refresh everything. It's so nice that you're opening this up. It's so enlightening. Basically, I don't have a question, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it could be just comment or reaction. Yeah.
Right, thank you. God bless.
Hello, sir. Earlier you were talking about the how in the diaspora there was little affinity of second generation Filipinos to the motherland. My question is, what do you think the state, the Filipino state and cultural associations of the Philippines can do better in order for it to, help people learn the languages that we have here back there, like overseas in, say, the UK, US, Canada, and other places where there are large Filipino diasporas, so that the culture can continue its own line?
Yeah, first of all, again, thank you for your questions, and I'll try to answer the ones that I can give an answer. Otherwise I'll just be speculating here. Just very quickly, because I think I was rushing, I didn't qualify. When I mean there's a failure of leadership, I'm talking about the people who were in a position to make an influence, to make an impact that they didn't. But all around the world, our best and brightest were helping the Dubais of this world to come into being. That's the other tragedy, right? You go to Dubai, you go to Singapore, a lot of this, they will talk about how brilliant your Filipino managers, professors, etc. were. So that was also a tragedy, that actually we were producing the great human capital, except it was not being utilized because the system was churning them out, either for political reasons, for economic reasons, or just because they wanted greener pastures, which they have a perfect right to. So let me just clarify that, because I think it would be unfair, because we produce great artists in the 20th century, great professor, etc. But the reality is that those who were in a position to make impact on our nation as a whole, they failed it big time. So that also tells you something about a system that promotes the worst kinds. I think the Greek had a term for that, kakistocracy, right? a system where which puts the opposite of best and brightest in positions of power. So let me be very clear about it. So I think it would be totally unfair to say, of course we created great minds, except they didn't end up serving their own country, right? Or they were driven into depression and exile or something worse. Right? So let me clarify on that. On the CHIP Act and all, actually there is a development in that. I was in Tokyo in late January and we had a conversation. So right now, for instance, there's a trilateral effort. I call it JAFUS, Japan, Philippine, US trilateral effort. And it's interestingly, the Americans were mentioning it, they expressly said, we want to make sure this doesn't look like two developed countries and one developing country. That we want to make it as collaborative as possible. And actually there are constant efforts to not only make the most out of the engineers and scientists we're producing, but also consciously integrate the Philippines later on into major semiconductor production, especially in packaging and design. The problem would be competing with Vietnam, and also with Thailand and Malaysia. So our card there will be our alliance with the United States. So there's no way we can compete with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand on purely economic terms. In fact, we lose to those countries. But if we leverage correctly our geopolitical position and our alliance with the United States, and this is where we need also good diplomats who can shame our allies to be more helpful to us. I mean, for heaven's sake, I just came from Washington, D.C. They were discussing like $60 billion for this country, $20 billion for that country. I mean, we're talking about one of these countries is actually a superpower in its own region. The Philippines were facing the biggest navy in the world, and they only gave us $1 billion over the past 10 years in military aid. Well, Ukraine is getting, what, 60, 70 billion. And well, Ukraine, I can't understand, they're in the middle of war. But, so I think we also had a failure of diplomacy. We didn't make the most out of our alliance with the United States. And we didn't make the most out of this positioning. And so we went from super pro-China to super pro-US, and that doesn't work. That's not smart. What we need is multi-alignment, right? What we need is, you know what I'm saying, right? Hedging, smart hedging, proactive hedging. And I think you cannot have that if you're not promoting the right people to the top position who think outside the box. Again, I don't want to put myself in trouble, I'm already in trouble, but that's the problem. We tend to promote very, orthodox thinking in our strategic approaches, and we are paying a price for that. Now about Filipinos, being more involved in the Philippines and all of that, I don't know, there's so many things. Just to keep within the theme, Tagalog is not that good, but we have some Tagalog institutes there, and they invited me out of nowhere to give a talk in Tagalog. And I was like, what? Okay, I was like, okay, let's discuss EDCA in Tagalog. The next thing I know, the guys there are Filipino Americans who are expecting to be the base here under EDCA. So there are many, many Filipino Americans who want to give back to their country right now. And what's happening in the West Philippine Sea is mobilizing that sense of, let's call it secondary nationalism, because they're American patriot, but they also love the Philippines. And I heard from a lot of my contacts who are in this world who were saying, so many Filipinos want to volunteer, to be based in. So you may have a situation of American EDCA bases filled with Filipino Americans, right? A lot of them coming from Guam or Hawaii or those places. That's interesting development. That's a very, very interesting development, right? My own uncles, they have the entire background. They're very invested in the West Philippine Sea and all of that. So that's what I'm saying. So, and then there's the food aspect. I think, with the rise of Erwan Yusuf and this kind of guys who have profiled in the United States and the Filipino food, this is bringing things together. I mean, I'm not an American Filipino, so I don't know enough. But from what little I know, is that there's so many pivot points to get the Filipino American community more involved. But having said that, I'll put myself in trouble again. So last time I checked, there are like what, 4 million Filipino Americans. Now, if you look at interest groups in the United States, of course we know which is the most influential interest groups, but I think the second most influential foreign policy interest group is the Indian American community. But I think the total population of Indian American is not so much more than us. Perhaps it's even fewer than us, Filipinos, right? Which makes you wonder, I don't want to be in trouble, but how I wish the Philippine American communities are more active in lobbying the US Congress, in lobbying the US administration to be more helpful to the Philippines, right? We're yet to receive a single modern fighter jet from the United States since, I don't know, 1960s or whatever. That's why we're trying to buy something, whatever, from Sweden. Right? No offense to Sweden, they're great people, but I'd rather have an American fighter jet than a Swedish fighter jet if I'm gonna face China, right? But unless there's an interest group, there's a strong Filipino American lobby, good luck with that. I mean, the joke in the town is you put 2 Filipino Americans, you get 3 organizations out of it, right? My friend Ronald Diamas, I mean, I'll put him in trouble. He said something like, he went somewhere in New Jersey, there were like 13 groups representing a single sub-region in the Philippines. I'm not gonna say which. So we're not gonna get anywhere like that. So you know what I'm saying? So I love them learning Tagalog, coming back to EDCA, that's great. But please also organize and push the Americans to be more helpful to us, including on the CHIPS Act and all of that, right? Now, Vietnam is a complicated case because a lot of Vietnamese there are South Vietnamese who hate the communist regime. But Indian community, even those who are not fans of Modi, they are patriotic, I mean, they love India, so they're pushing the government to be helpful. Hey, grabe, the way America is like super chummy with India's Modi and all of that, I think that's a big reflection of the power of the Indian American community. I can go on so it makes me wonder, there are like 4 or 5 million Filipinos, how many Filipino American congressmen do we have, or senators? So there's a disproportion there. There's a lack of organization. So as much as you want to blame the Philippines, it looks like our communities abroad have to do a little bit more too, right? You get what I'm saying? So this is what I know a little bit about. The rest, I don't want to look like a fool. I hope that was helpful. Right, yes, thank you. Yes, sir.
Richard, thank you for an excellent presentation. Would you talk, coming from academia, would you talk to us please a little about your perspective, vision, and strategy for education, for current education system here? We're in the middle of, well, I don't know if in the middle, but we largely got along quite a few months into EdCom 2 and making some progress. But what are your perspectives on the future of our education?
Are there other questions? No questions? No
Comment?
Is there any?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
okay.
Yeah, please.
Richard, thank you very much for your amazing presentation. I like the analogy you used of beginning from the history and going as far back as the 15th, 14th century, which really brings...
In 1 hour.
In 1 hour, and it's amazing.
Sorry about that.
And most importantly, you mentioned Latin America, and you asked the question, why isn't the Philippines adopting Spanish language and things like that? But going back to the question of Ilustrados, I think if you look at Latin America today, there is a new, what you call a new Ilustrado, right? There's a new breed of leaders, the progressive leaders. You have leaders like Gabriel Boric in Chile, Gustavo Petro in Colombia, the recently elected president in Ecuador, President Lula in Brazil. Is it the problem that perhaps in the Philippines is that we need to rethink the concept of Ilustrado? Perhaps these Ilustrados are within the purview of the people. It's just that they have not been identified by the masses or the people who have the power to bring them into decision-making capabilities, to bring that much needed change that you're talking about. I think somebody like Villar would be a good illustration of an Ilustrado. I mean, what he's done, building wealth from nothing. And there are many others, right? And so that's what I'm saying, right? if we move away that looking just from the Spanish language, what about those nice things that Latin America is doing? Thanks.
Thank you. Is there one more question here?
Sir, good afternoon. First, I would like to express my gratitude for this opportunity. Well, number one, I was impressed because you touched so many subjects like French Revolution, and also you mentioned Marxist philosophy or things like that. And then, well, number one, what I can say is that revolution is for everybody, irrespective of social, ideological background, and this is also true to history. I was impressed that you mentioned Dostoevsky, but I also expect that you will mention Nietzsche. Well, anyway, and also you mentioned about economic prosperity, no? Well, number one, in order for us to emancipate our country from the kind of economic stagnation, revolution is for everybody, not only for the elite. So I expect that in your next discussion, with all due respect, please allocate about Sakdalista, Hermano Puli, because these are also important historical figures that make contribution to the Philippine movement. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for that. I'm glad that there was no mention of like Bukele. We're going down the road of Bitcoin discussion and all of that. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, of course, I'll go back to the question of education and also the role of masses, right? But, you know, maybe we can have that discourse in UP or someone else. But going to, yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed also in the Philippines is, you know, we're not like Japan, seniority culture, but for some reason, young leaders in this country are not getting fair share of political decision-making power as we see in many countries. I mean, for instance, like the French Prime Minister right now is like 34 years old or something like that. Why do we even have a 40-year-old cutoff for the presidents? And then, yeah, Ecuador, I think the guy's my age, 35, 36, right? He's actually married, he was born in Florida. So we can go on and on. Boris the same, 36, 37. So that's where I think, you know, there's something wrong with the system that is not allowing for those kind of figures to come out. I mean, we have examples like maybe Vico Soto. I can think about like Mayor Vico Soto, but it cannot be just one person, right? That's why you talk about Ilustrados, because it's supposed to be a whole generation of people, right? And in fact, this is the 21st century, for heaven's sake, so it cannot be the sons and daughters of the landed elite. It has to come from the masses, it has to come from the middle classes, and it doesn't, so it's really not about class anymore. In our era of social mobility, no matter how limited, so I mean, I come from Baguio. I don't come from any of the elite families. I graduated from UP. I didn't graduate from, I don't know, some fancy place. But there was enough in this world to allow me to gain some platform and voice. But I wouldn't be able to even give this lecture if folks in Leon Gallery didn't bother to pay attention to me. Which tells you about the importance of, I don't want to use the word gatekeepers because that's a little bit negative connotation, but those who have platforms, I really encourage them to move beyond their usual gentlemen. You know, like, so usually it's ganun eh. It's like, you know, like I always say, our problem is not just the oligarchy on top. It's the mini oligarchies you see in the academy. The patron clientelist system is everywhere in this country. It's in showbiz industry, it's in academia, it's everywhere. The politica inside the office. So you have to break it in every sphere, right? And at the same time, it's very important for people of the platform like Leon Gallery, or it could be media, or it could be an influential podcaster, right? For them to do the right thing. But I would say, and let's go actually to my really last slide. I mean, if Rizal were alive today, he would be a vlogger. And you don't have to be a wealthy guy to be a vlogger, right? I mean, literally, I'm vlogging myself right now as we speak. I have no production team whatsoever. I mean, sometimes I get lunch from my cousin to make a thumbnail or something like that. So there is enough still out there. Despite all the limitations of the system, I think there's always enough. And that's why I had to emphasize the quote there by Rizal. You have to suffer, but you have to work. You have to keep on going on, and then you'll break through. In my wildest dream, I didn't think that I'll be one day invited here to talk about Ilustrados, because there are so many more eminent historians. I'm not even a historian, more competent than me to discuss this. But I think because I'm just so shameless and just like threw out any idea out there and pretended, I mean, you fake it until you make it, right? And so much forced myself to learn about so many things in a limited time. Then maybe the good people notice me, and now we have this. So actually, in many ways, I hope what I'm doing here, the little discussion we're having here, will just be kind of a, it is a path-breaking kind of approach, because I'm sure there are many more smarter people out there who just don't have the platform, don't have the combination of factors that allowed me to come here, right? So it is also incumbent on those who have the platforms, right? Or galleries or cultural capital to give voice to those. It's also important for us to pay attention to the new generation of business leaders from the established families, and not just dismiss all of them, mga tapo yan, mga conglomerates yan. No, a lot of them actually are producing new generation of more forward-thinking. So build coalitions, build bridges, build conversation. You see, I think one of the things that we have to really work on is, ang daming magagaling na Pinoy nowadays in different fields, but we're not just talking too much. I mean, honestly, I want to name names, but like, it's so hard to bring prominent people together in the Philippines. It's so easy in other cultures, right? I mean, again,
Richard,
yes.
I'd like to butt in. I'd like to ask you a question.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
Richard, Rico Hizon, how are you?
Yes.
Impressive presentation on the Ilustrado.
Sorry, you look
But-
younger. I didn't.
Without wearing the suit. We've had 17 presidents since 1899, from Aguinaldo to Manuel L. Quezon, Magsaysay, Macapagal, Marcos Sr., Corazon Aquino, all the way up until Noynoy, Duterte, and now Marcos Jr., whose term ends in 2028. Putting all of these presidents together, what would be the best characteristics to morph all of these best traits of these presidents to run our country today? Minus the vlogging, the social media, and the 31 million votes, and the popularity of all of these presidents. And my follow-up question to that would be, who would be a perfect president for this country who never became president?
Ang thought ka yan, ah. I like how you carry yourself into this. There's still education on. Thank you, Rico, for that. Those are good questions. I said that would be a different lecture on that. But no, I mean, for me, I'm a very pragmatic idealist, right? Don't look for Tesla, just look for a Prius. That could work for us, right? I'm honestly, I'm not looking out. I mean, I look at the options of could be our next presidents and all of that. Like, I'm being very realistic. Like, of course, there are certain people I want them to win, but I'm not betting on it given the current circumstances. Having said that, there's so much fluidity. The 31 million doesn't exist anymore. It just evaporated right after the elections, right? I know it was just a momentary kind of group coming together. I mean, I think there's enough ruthlessness and unpredictability and fluidity in the Philippines to create enough space to push for changes. And changes don't come just with electing the right president, right? If you have the best, I mean, let's say you're pro-Lenny, right? Had Lenny won, and then ganito yung Congress and Senate mo and all of that, good luck with pushing forward with anti-corruption, anti-dan. It's just not gonna happen. So change has to happen at every single level, right? Leadership has to be parang multi-level marketing yan, di ba? You cannot just fix the guy at the top, right? You have to fix at every level. That's why it's hard. That's why nation building is not easy. Because we have this illusion that you get the right president there and everything will follow through magically the next day. You do one moment of EDSA and then everything will be fine next day. It doesn't work that way. I mean, go and ask the Swedish how many times they had to do labor union organization in the past 200 years before they become Sweden of today, right? Success comes by constant. That's why I said it's not even marathon, it's Olympics. You have to have multiple types of mobilization. Vlogging is important, sure. Presidential position is important, but who you put in LGU position is important. Who you put in media is important. I mean, my goodness, when I was a kid, The only thing I remember from media is patay, patay. You know what I'm saying? It's always about news is all about that. Where is the critical thinking? I mean, thank God because of podcasts, you know, people like me have a little bit more chance of having long-form conversation. And then before, they're always like, ay, no, sweet lang yan, ganun. That's why you put humor into it, right? Stop whining. Oh, they don't like intellectual. Then put humor, then make it funny, and then call Ronald Llamas to be your guest. And then, you get what I'm saying? Until you get the formula right. And then it's right for 1 year, then people get tired of you, then you reinvent, you innovate yourself. So the constant innovation is not just in industries. Kaya dapat we did more question and answer. One of the poor guys in lecture. That's why I'm saying it has, kaya I love that quote from Rizal. You have to suffer and work and keep on innovating at every level. And my point is, I saw complacency, I saw stagnation, I saw lack of innovation in every important field of our society for far too long. And I saw so many super talented, best and brightest, including Rico Izon and all, who are moved to the BBC of this world, which is great. I'm happy that these people succeeded abroad. But how I wish you had 100 Rico Izons here, successful, working, and properly remunerated and all of that. Do you get what I'm saying? So, I mean, speaking of vlogging, I mean, I'm just shocked. Like some people make, I don't know, like 30 million on TikTok selling, I don't know, whatever. But like, it's good. I'm happy for them. But I hope you also pay properly. People who are in malls and people who are teachers, people who are ordinary, which goes back to our education sector. How can you fix this country when the most fundamental way of fixing a country is so broken? And not only it's broken, it's led by people that I'm not sure are really bastions of educational excellence. Okay, I understand. The secretary is whatever. Hi guys. Okay. Hi. So wala magpasalamat sa inyo. But okay, fine. But sana naman yung USEC, yung ASEC, may PhD sa education, may background sa education, can do a proper analysis. Instead of, I don't know, whatever, go around, learn from Vietnam. My goodness, Vietnam's per capita is barely above the Philippines. It just overtook us in 2011. They ranked number 8 in PISA. Number 8. They beat practically 80% of OECD countries. And then we were like second to the last. And we're happy that the next year we're third to the last or something like that. Like, we have a functional literacy crisis. The last thing we needed is people in charge of no knowledge whatsoever about education at all levels of leadership. Again, I'm okay for political reason, ganyan talaga, di ba? Ganyan talaga, what can we do? But sana naman, di ba? But as I said, I mean, how I wish if I had more energy and power, I would go to provinces and meet more teachers. And like, we need to do that. I mean, it's lovely we're having this conversation here, our nice corners in podcasts, me traveling here, traveling there. But actually what we need to go is we need to go to the provinces. We need to go to the peripheries of these countries. We need to give hope and energy to people across the country. We have to speak more vernacular. We have to speak more in different languages, right? We have to be flexible, right? So, ang daming hindi natin nagawa because we focus on the wrong problems and we come up with dumber and dumber solutions to more and more complicated problems.
Richard, I totally understand about the grassroots leadership. But of course, the leadership...
You want to come here?
No.
You can do the moderation.
But of course, the leadership has to start from the top. He has to lead, or she has to lead by example. And of course, having traveled abroad, lived abroad, educated and given seminars abroad, they always say that we don't really have the right leader to run this country. What we need is a Singaporean benevolent dictator like Lee Kuan Yew. They would always say that, having lived in Singapore and overseas, they say that we don't need this democracy. What we need is a benevolent dictator that will discipline the Filipino people. And they say we need a leader who has the characteristics of a Lee Kuan Yew. What do you say to that?
Rico, last time I checked, all the dictators were among the most undisciplined people. Some of them
So what do you think of Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, as Deng Xiaoping told Lee Kuan Yew, how I wish I only had Shanghai to take care of, right? And that's the problem.
Okay.
Singapore is just a city-state, right? We have urban-rural divides. We have, I mean, my goodness, from the north of country to the south of country, divisions are huge, right? That's why for me, Singapore was always the wrong model for us. Of course, you can get some things here and there, but look at mid-sized countries. And honestly, why should we look at Singapore, which is so ahead of us, light years? It's almost ridiculous. It's like I hate to say, it's like you're Geely and you're trying to copy Lamborghini. It doesn't work that way, right? If you're Geely, you look at Toyota, right? So if you're Philippines, you look at Thailand, for instance, mid-sized country, or Turkey, for instance, or who knows, maybe even Colombia, and we can learn something. That's what I'm saying. We're looking at models which is totally grapes and oranges, totally like grapes kasi posh. Like it's not comparable, right? So we have to look at, I mean, siguro kung meron ka ng Manila, you can look at Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, whatever. But if you're the president of the Philippines, you want to think about governance in a democracy, mature democracy like ours, then and not to mention Singapore has a lot of problems. I don't want to go into the family feuds and all of that. I mean, ibang usapan because I want to still go back to Singapore and all. But you get what I'm saying. So again, we have wrong role models. Not because Lee Kuan Yew was bad. I think he was a competent leader for a city-state, for Singapore in 1960s and 70s. But Philippines is not that country. It's a totally different case. I mean, that's what I'm saying. We have to constantly look around the world in mid-sized country, developing countries. So I like the case of Colombia, for instance. I would like the case of, I don't know, Thailand, for instance. I mean, look at what they did in Thailand. I mean, what they achieved. Kids, right? They got the most number of votes of any party, future forward party, right? Against all odds. Except, unlike us, they're not lucky in the sense that they have an absolutist king, who's I don't know, half of the time in Russia or in Germany or something, and they have a military junta. And look at what Pita, right? Look at what Pita did in Thailand against all odds, right? So that's the other thing. I think our role models are not comparable, or even wrong role models, right? And yeah, this is a tragedy of the Philippines. Our democratic leaders were not the best, and then we get the dictators are even worse, right? So probably we have to get out of that binary and look for something else. And something else that fits the needs of the 21st century. You know, Lee Kuan Yew, he was doing in the 60s and 70s when there was no social media, there was no global scrutiny, there was no Gen Zs and millennials. You know, it's a totally different world right now, right? So we cannot be also, and as much as I talk about history, we also have to talk about adaptation. We also have to talk about what can fit the purpose of the moment. But that's why I like the education question. It's difficult, it's really difficult, but I think that really goes to the heart of this issue. But the reality is that you're not going to fix the education system in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's really a generational issue. So in the meantime, what do you do? And I think this is where leadership is important. If you have the right group of leaders, right, who don't just whine about disinformation and whine about vote buying. Of course, these are realities. You think the opposition in Turkey or opposition in any other countries are not facing odds? I mean, for heaven's sake, look at what Navalny had to put up with in Russia. So maybe if we care about learning from other countries when they have 10 times more difficulties than us, we'll stop whining and actually fight the good fight the right way and in a consistent enough fashion so that we can make changes. But the last thing I want to say is that we have to also curb our expectations. Again, you're not going to get transformation overnight. So step by step, take it at every step, at every election. Prepare for 2025, prepare for 2028. Be happy with successes in few LGUs here. Be happy with few successes in business sectors here. And then you can move forward as a nation. I think this is really matters. This is transforming in a totally different conversation right now. But I hope you see what I'm doing here. I'm not here to give you guys answers to everything. Although I think I have answers to some questions and all that. But it's really that sensibility. It's a mode of thinking that I want us to develop as Filipinos. Because honestly, I think it just doesn't work. Whining about the past doesn't work. Being overly idealistic also doesn't work. Being cynical definitely doesn't work. We cannot afford to be cynical. And in fact, there's enough reason, there's enough good there for us to have hope about our country and move forward in the right direction. Thank you very much. I'll just keep it there because I don't So that means you have to invite me back and we have no more conversation about this. Because kanina, there was a moment I almost blanked. I said like, shucks, I have so much more to discuss, but we don't have enough time and all that. So I hope you guys don't take it as the final version of this. I mean, this is actually a 3-hour lecture, honestly, that I had to compress into 1 hour. So we can go back to some parts of this, and please feel free to reach out to me. You can get my contacts, or you can just reach out to me directly in social media. But I really hope that this will be just the beginning of a series of conversation. This is just a second iteration, 2.0 pa lang ito, ng itong software na ito. But we want to update it, we want to improve it. And thank you for your questions, because those questions make me think. There's a back brain, right, which thinks even more when you get those kind of nice questions. So thank you for your passion. I mean, I was worried that you guys would get super bored and like but apparently it was not that bad. So I'm happy now. So hopefully we can work with that and come back and have more of these kind of conversations. Maraming salamat. Mabuhay ang Pilipinas. Salamat, Professor. Once again. Thank you. I'm doing 5 things at the same time. Like I'm trying. Hopefully we have more of this conversation moving forward. Yes, please. You got this program? Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So one by one. Yeah. Let's 20 pesos each. Sorry about that, but makalimit kami. Okay, yeah, let's go. Yeah, sorry about that.